Well, it's an honor to be here at an event celebrating the enormous contributions that Richard Erickson made. My paper is also going to tell a story. That story took place in about the same period that you were fighting the peel, banana peel. Banana peel. Banana was a good word, actually. Please. I didn't give my word. And it involves, my story involves two criminal codes from the 1870s. And I'm telling this story in part because when the article that I wrote in the for the first volume of the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies came out, Richard, this is in 1982, Richard read it and made a point of telling me how much he enjoyed the article. And that doesn't happen very often. That, maybe your mother and a few others, but when I can see why he enjoyed when I tell you this story, because it's about knowledge production. Now, I didn't know the word knowledge production until I was invited to give a paper here. And it's possible that Richard didn't know it in 1982, although he was working in that field all his life. The two codes were a code by a gentleman named R.S. Wright, who was doing a code for the island of Jamaica, and James Fitzjames Stevens, whose code everyone knows here, and which Canada adopted in 1892. Now, how did I come about writing that code? In the 60s, I started getting grants to write a book on the machinery of law reform. And I was researching and publishing little things, and the 70s went by. I had a sabbatical in 79, and I was determined. I'd taken all this money. I was going into the third decade of research. I was doing other things in those years, and I hadn't published it. So I had half the year sabbatical in Israel and half in Cambridge. And I sent some material to Israel that I'd work on there, and one of the chapters was on codification. And I'm sitting on the balcony of in the apartment in Netanya overlooking the Mediterranean. I'm working away, and I'm making good progress on this chapter. I'm dealing with the father of codification, Bentham, and then some of the American codes, which from the 1800s, which the criminal law people from the States would know, and Macaulay's great code for India. But there was one footnote that I had, which it was about a code that an R.S. Wright had done for the island of Jamaica. And I couldn't find out anything about it apart from one reference to it. And a guy from the Hebrew University said, I've done lots of work. I did a lot of work in the archives in London, and go there and you'll find some of the answers that you're looking for. So when I got to Cambridge, I went to the Kew Gardens and I started the research. There was lots of files, and I discovered this is an important code. And the title of the article is R.S. Wright's Forgotten Model Code Story of the History of the Criminal Law. It was an important code because it was more than a code for the island of Jamaica. It was commissioned by the Colonial Office to be a code for all of the colonies and perhaps for England itself. Moreover, the documents show that while this code was in the process of being drafted and reviewed, the Colonial Office asked James Fitzjames Stephen to review it. And it was, the documents make it perfectly clear that it was while he was reviewing Wright's code that he decided to produce his own code. And this was all news to me. So I was able to fill in that footnote, and then it turned into a paragraph, and then into a short article, which I was thinking of sending to the Criminal Law Review. And in the end, it was 300 footnotes, and fortunately, the Oxford Journal had just started, and they needed a long paper. And it's clearly my favorite article. It consumed the whole of my sabbatical. I never did that book on the machinery of law reform. It's a very old-fashioned name even to start with. And I always tell, and it's affected my career in that in telling a story, I learned a great deal, which I wouldn't have done from a normal legal analysis. The big point that I learned, and I'm embarrassed to say it, it's naive to say it, is that a code or any piece of legislation reflects the philosophy of the drafter of the legislation. Now, we don't see that as clearly today because documents are drafted by committees and various compromises come in, and it's not quite as clear as one might expect. On the other hand, we can see now the Harper government's anti-crime legislation that came in earlier this week clearly shows the philosophy of the drafters and of the government. But I had assumed, naively, even though I had taught criminal law for 20 years, that our code was inevitable. Oh, of course, this is our criminal code. In the same way as one thinks that I always thought that the Toronto City Hall was the way a city hall, the old Toronto City Hall should be built. And there are lots of examples of that. But you can see that it reflects the radical views of Wright in contrast to the conservative views of Stephen. Now, who was Wright? He was an Oxford Don and a barrister who later became a judge and a highly respected judge. He was radical in that he believed in that the House of Lords should be abolished, that land should be nationalized. He did a great amount of work for the labor movement. He supported women's rights. He gave his £300 yearly sum from Oriel College, Oxford, to support scholarships at Girton College, Cambridge. Stephen, we know, was a conservative. He didn't believe in extending the franchise. He thought judges were fantastic, and that's what he wanted to be. When Canada chose in 1892, without really giving Wright's code much of a chance, Stephen's conservative code. Now, let me give you a few examples of how the codes differed. I'll try to be brief on this. Take the offense of sedition. Wright's code said, as it should, a seditious purpose is to change the government or to change things by force or other illegal means. Stephen's definition, which then became the definition in Canada or in Australia and lots of other places, was, no, sedition is when you try to stir up unrest by your words or actions in the populace. He wanted to keep the public under control. In morality, offenses involving morality, buggery and bestiality, not surprisingly, Stephen had a 10-year minimum penalty for those offenses. Wright, I guess, was forced to make them offenses, but he called them, with a minor penalty, common nuisances.